Before we start with, I'm just going to tell you, today's going to be tighter. We're going to be rushing more than yesterday. It's just the way it is. But before we start today's presentation, I realized I didn't really talk about the last two expenses worksheets in your packet, so I just want to make sure that we're not going to use these tools. We weren't intending to use these tools, but I want to tell you about these tools because you will need them when you go through your own exercises. So the first one looks like this, and it says expenses worksheet up in the corner. Can people find that? It's pretty self-explanatory, but I just want to tell you, you will get this in electronic form, and when you get it in electronic form, you can fill it in electronically, obviously. And what you do is start with your current year's expenses. You can put in your own categories, your own line item categories or program categories, whichever is easiest. And then you put in your current year expenses. And then using that worksheet that we used at the end of the day yesterday, where you looked at your programs and what was going to increase and decrease, you can say, okay, by year 5 or year 3, whichever you were using, those expenses will have increased or decreased by whatever amount you assume. And then so you might want to take your pens and circle this little bottom box here. When you get it electronically, it will be yellow. It will be highlighted. And that's the box. That's the box that's going to give you your number that you need at the end of the period of time, okay? So that will be the number that you're shooting for when you're putting together your revenues. And it will automatically calculate the difference between your expenses and your revenues. When you get the electronic version, the two worksheets will talk to each other, and they will tell you whether you are under the amount of revenue you need or over the amount of revenue you need. We hope it'll be the latter, right? But by how much? It'll calculate that for you, okay? And I think I told everybody that Tanya and Alexandra from Trog, Andrea from Trog, both were trained in this methodology. So they can also help as you go along and if you have questions, okay? Easier than emailing me in the States. Okay. Revenues, the money coming in, the magic money that we need to run our organizations. Today, this is what we talk about. Whoops, already it skipped. Come on. So, basically, when you're starting this part with your teams, and we are going to do a team exercise on this, but you will start with that box, that highlighted box that I told you, and that's your reasonable estimate of how much you are going to need. Now, what I'm going to do in the very beginning part today is talk about all of the possible forms of revenue that you as an NGO can call upon to support your work. And as I'm going through these one by one, and we're going to have a couple of presentations of Serbian organizations that have looked at some of these revenue sources. As we are going through this, I want you to be thinking optimistically and creatively, all right? I want you to look at each one of these revenue sources as a possibility for you. You can come back and rule them out later, but I don't want you to rule them out the first time around. I don't want anybody saying, this is not possible in Serbia. I don't want that thinking in your head. I don't want that, I don't want that negativity. It may not be, okay? You can come back later and say that. But at least for this first round, let's be optimistic. Let's think about what's possible. So with that, as you can see, this is kind of divided into two broad categories. And I talked about this a little bit at the beginning yesterday. The two broad categories are gifts and grants and earned income. And we're going to talk about everything in those two broad categories. Gifts and grants are the direct contributions you receive, and they are defined as those contributions for which the donors do not expect something of personal value in return. Okay? So even though the donor may expect reports or something like that, that's not, those are still grants. Okay? Earned income, by contrast, the donor, or in this case, client, will get some kind of goods or services in return. Something of value to them. And that's the distinction. One other thing. When I use the term donor, I don't mean exclusively the big international or foundation agencies. I mean anyone who contributes to your organization. So someone who, someone who contributes $10 to your organization, I call a donor. So donor doesn't necessarily mean the big donor. Anybody who gives. Okay? Is that clear? Okay. Let's talk about sort of the pluses and minuses of this big category called gifts and grants. And I'm not going to go over it in great detail. But one thing about giving is that a number of you are trying to create citizen participation in one way or another, right? Well, what better way of creating citizen participation than people actually contributing? So it reinforces a culture of philanthropy. Usually it doesn't require a lot of upfront investment on your part. That's not always true. I know the big grants, right? Some of you are slaving over writing big grants. That takes a lot of time. But often it doesn't take as much time as, for example, starting a business, which is one of the earned income options. It's low risk, right? You may have invested time in getting a gift or a grant, but you haven't invested capital. You haven't invested your own organization's money to get a gift or a grant. Either you get it or you don't get it. Often those gifts and grants are an opportunity for visibility for your organization, especially if the giver is prominent. Compared to a lot of the earned income options, it's a relatively quick turnaround. You get you submit the proposal, I know this is not always true, especially with the big international organizations, but often you can submit a proposal, and a few months later you will hear whether you're getting it or not. And certainly if you're approaching an individual or a corporation, usually they can give you a pretty quick answer. And the reason that most of you all are looking at large international sources is that they make big gifts. That's the real reason, above all, that you go after them. So those are all advantages. What are the limitations? The larger the gift, the more likely they are to come with restrictions, right? The donor wants to pull the strings. Larger program grants may distract you from your central mission. Okay, let's be honest. We've all done this. We have all done this. There's money out there. We're going to go for it. It may not be quite what we want to do. It may not be quite in our mission, but we go after it. And then what happens? What happens is we get distracted from our core. So that's the downside. If you have just a few grants, large grants from just a few organizations, individuals, companies, it actually can kind of jeopardize your independence, right? Because you're pretty dependent on those one or two or three, and they can say, well, maybe we didn't like your last campaign, or the way this was done, or the way that was done. It's an issue. The biggest thing is they don't stick around very long, right? They give to you this week, and then they don't give to you, or this year, or this 3 years, and then they're not around for the next time. So they lack stability and longevity. And then the biggest thing is they're totally beyond your control. The decision is entirely in the hands of the donor, and you don't have any say about it. That's a real downside. Does that make sense? Any comments or questions on that kind of big list of pluses and minuses? I mean, you've all been there. Everybody in this room has been there. So. Annual gift programs. Okay, an annual gift program is an organized annual campaign on the part of your organization to go out and ask people, could be individuals, could be companies, for support, for direct support for your organization. And Trog, are you going to talk a little bit about that? Okay, great. And so it can be a good source of income for your organization, but it requires a lot of cultivation of donors, and it usually brings in relatively small gifts. And you have to be consistent in asking year to year. Now, the way these campaigns work is typically you select a time of year. Many places, many NGOs select the holiday season, the fall, before Christmas time or at Christmas time, because why? People are feeling generous. And so that is often a good time. Now, in the U.S., they do that also because that's the end of our tax year. And so if they get tax deductions, they want to get them, they want to make sure they get their tax deduction by the end of the year. We could talk all day about how you put together an annual gift campaign. But before I went on to the next slide, but ignore the next slide. Typically, how you start is you start with the people who've already made gifts to you. And you make sure that you have the contact information, the email addresses for them, right? Now, you all may have had, some of you may have had campaigns where people made anonymous gifts in boxes or something like that. Have any of you had that kind of thing where people have given you money but you don't know who it is? You guys have. Anybody else? No. Okay, so you know, by and large, you know who has been giving to you. Do you have their contact information? If people are, how many of you have had people other than large international or Serbian organizations give you money? How many of you have had individuals give you money? Yeah, I know, but any of the rest of you have had, no. Has anybody in the room had individuals? I know you guys have, I know they have. Has anybody else had individuals give them money? Really? No money? Okay. Has anybody else had corporations give you money? Okay. And have those been big gifts for programs, or have they been smaller gifts to support your core? Smaller gifts to support your core operations. Okay? And you have their contact information, obviously. Okay. So, you know, before starting an annual gifts program, most of you have not had a base of individuals to start building on. So you need to start being creative about who would be interested as either individuals or smaller corporate gifts in what you do. Some of the places to start are with your own board. Some people get, oh my gosh, they're already giving their time, and how can we ask them to give their money? Maybe I'll get you to comment on that rather than my commenting as someone from a different part of the world. But in most, usually it is possible to ask. Another group, those who benefit from or have the potential of benefiting from what you do, right? And anybody who believes in the mission of what you are doing. All of those are possible contributors. So I just want you guys to start thinking creatively about who might be givers. And then start thinking about how would you capture their addresses, how would you, their email addresses, and how might you start reaching out to them? How might you start building this database of potential local contributors? Now I want to, that's annual giving, all right, that's where you're going to go out year after year after year and build. And what you do in these campaigns also is that you know who has given what, and the next year you ask them for a little bit more, right? Whatever they gave the previous year, you ask them for a little bit more, so that over time you're building. And it can be done. There are at least 2 groups in the room who have done that. Okay, that's annual campaigns. And by the way, they differ from membership campaigns because members get something of value to them in return. Usually they get a magazine, or they get to come to a dinner, or they get, something. They get something of value in return. Annual givers, we just ask them to give, and we just ask them to give. And we always, very important thing, everybody who gives to you, if they give this much or this much, what's the most important thing that you do after you receive that gift? Thank you for saying thank you. Yes, you say thank you. You say thank you. And before you go back to them for another contribution, or at least at the same time, what else do you do? If I've given you $10 last year, thank you. How did I use your money? Now, most of the time you can't say specifically, but you can say, here are the things our organization did because of you. Now, the other thing is, the more you can break it down and say, you made a difference in this way, the more attractive it is to that donor. The flip side of that, however, is if you break everything down programmatically, then you don't have that flexible money, which is really what we're trying to build here. But you can often say something like, you've seen it's really hard for a lot of the organizations in the room. The share group, the groups that are doing citizen participation and watchdogging and all of that kind of thing. It's very hard to break that down into discrete pieces. So you're just going to have to say, our organization did this on your behalf. But others can say, we served 100 families with young children, and it costs us this amount to serve each child, right? Okay, enough on that. Donors, so now we're going to go to the category of probably larger gifts. So the annual gifts are usually smaller. And you might have a couple of categories. You might have, people who give, under $50, and people who give over $50, and people who give over $100, something like that. I don't know what your categories would be, but you can organize it that way. You can have individual donors, corporate donors. Now we're going to talk more about gifts in the larger gifts, and we're going to talk about the value of giving from people within, in your case, Serbia, or the community you serve, all right, if it's smaller than the country, and who you can go to. So inside your community that you serve, you can go to individuals. We just talked about that. We can talk about businesses that are headquartered within your community or doing business here. We can talk about foundations, again, within the community you serve. We could talk about government within the community you serve. Obviously, if you're watchdogging government, you're probably not going to get contributions from them. And any other donors that you can think about that might be within the community. In some places, that's like church organizations sometimes give, civic organizations sometimes give, etc. The important thing about donors within your community, givers within your community, is those gifts tend to be more consistent over time than the ones from outside your community. And why is that? Well, sorry, I went to the next slide too quickly. The reason is that they can see, feel, and touch what it is you're doing. They are potential beneficiaries or know people who can be potential beneficiaries. The large international donors are doing it because of their own agendas, right? Let's be real. They've got their own agendas, and those agendas may change over time. Okay. Gifts from donors outside the community. This includes diaspora givers, right? People who used to be here, have gone somewhere else, have done well. I'm going to give you some caution about that in a minute. Businesses from outside, foundations from outside. These are the people I think most of you have been depending on, right? Most of you have been depending on people from the outside, right? Whose budget comes more than half from entities outside Serbia? Yeah? Most of you? Right. So these are the people you already know about. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time.
Is there anyone except for Divas Foundation that gets money from diaspora?
Yeah, you guys do. I'm going to talk about that in a minute. I'm going to talk about diaspora in a little bit more detail. Not a lot, right? Not a lot. The national and international agencies, others that you may think of, outside. Here's the thing. They tend to be less long-lasting. We've already talked about that. My caution about diaspora givers. Almost every time I'm somewhere, they say, oh, there are these people who've moved to Chicago, or we know there are lots of Serbians in Chicago, or we know there are lots of people from Guyana in Brooklyn, in New York, or we know there are lots of people from Poland in Pittsburgh, or the UK, or Germany, or wherever, okay? Here is my caution about that. Unless you actually know those people or have direct links to them, it is probably not worth doing. I know a lot of organizations that have expended a lot of money trying to make campaigns in Pittsburgh and Chicago and London and Frankfurt. And it hardly ever pays back. Now, what does pay back is if you have a direct link with someone, right? DVEX has, let's be honest, a lot of direct links. You have a rather unique circumstance.
Yes, we are lucky with that we have right. That is recognized in the diaspora.
Right.
But actually we are trying so many other channels.
Exactly.
That not only directly connect with the brand.
Yeah.
We are using the media there, we are using the Facebook, and just presenting projects.
Yeah.
And we are presenting projects on the Kickstarters where it's not our diaspora, it's
right.
someone else's diaspora.
Right. Right, exactly. You're looking at international donors, not necessarily diaspora, and you're going to get a chance to share more about that. I think, though, my experience is that unless you have some kind of direct link, it's very difficult to develop that as a source. And both Tanya and Anna will have a chance to talk about what they have been able to do. And the final thing is external donors, because they are coming with their own agenda, are more likely to support specific projects that match their agenda than they are to support your core costs, right? They want to pay for programs and not for administration. I don't even think we'll spend a lot of time on this. Just a couple of things. The nice thing about getting gifts from individuals is you can continue to cultivate them over time for larger and larger gifts. The downside of corporations, corporate gifts, is that they tend to, they will go up and down with their own profits. So the problem is that just as just at the time that you are probably having a higher demand for services because the economy has gone down, the corporates are going to be giving less because their profits have gone down. So it underscores the importance of having multiple sources of revenues that will balance each other out in those kind of circumstances. Foundations like to fund innovation, and they usually don't want to fund for more than 2 or 3 years. Government, particularly those who are in the country, and some of you know this all too well, is they want to control. Governments always want to control what you're doing. So if you are working with a government entity, you have to be very clear, very straightforward. You are supporting our agenda. We're not supporting your agenda. And sometimes you have to turn it down, right? These guys said, we're not even going to go to certain sources because of what our mission is. Okay, so those are sources of gifts and grants. So I hope as I'm going through these categories, your wheels are spinning a bit to think about, okay, who do we know in these various categories? Who might we call upon for contributions? And then finally we have, fundraising events. Who in the room has done a fundraising event? This is the thing that you take on. Maybe you have a dinner, maybe you have a lottery or a raffle, various kinds of events. Who has done a fundraising event? You guys have, I know. Really? Have you? Have you guys or no?
Yes.
Sort of, yes, okay. What was it? What kind?
Meal sale. But,
Food sale, like
Food
meal
sale,
sale.
okay.
It's cake sale, actually.
A what?
A sale of cakes.
Okay, now that's different. Well, yeah, that's different. That's more like because people got cakes, right? Meals. So it's like a bake sale, what we would call a bake sale. Yeah? Okay. Here's the thing. Here's the thing about events. And I know Anna has done big events, small events, all kinds of events. Here's the thing about events. They are very, very labor intensive. You might say we got all the food free, all the wine free, the venue, the location free, right? But your staff and your volunteers spend hours and hours and hours on it. So don't discount that cost of fundraising events. And the second thing is that they tend to have decreasing return over time. Either you have to make it more and more and more exciting and special every year to maintain the same level of revenue, or if you do the same thing year after year, people start getting bored and it starts falling off. And that's pretty universally true. Now, the nice thing about events sometimes is that they give you a lot of visibility. And if you can tie them to your mission, all the better. So I'm going to give you an example of an event that generally Shannon hates events. Sorry. They're just so time consuming. But I'm going to give you an example of an event that I think is a really good event because it's closely tied to the mission and it furthers the mission. I'm only a consultant about a quarter of my time. 3/4 of my time I have a day job, and my day job is with a group called Synergos that is in New York. And Synergos' mission is addressing poverty and equity issues throughout the developing world. We have an annual event, which was last week in New York, where we do we call it University for a Night, and we do two things. Number one, we honor people who have made a difference in addressing poverty and equity issues in the developing world. For example, we have honored Queen Rania of Jordan. We have honored Kofi Annan. We have honored Bill Clinton. People who have made a difference in our mission, we honor them. The second thing we do, which I think is even more powerful, it's a dinner. So first we present the awards, and then everyone comes to dinner. And every table has a topic. And the topic might be women and girls, or the topic might be water needs in Africa, or you get the idea. There are various topics, and everybody who comes gets to select what table they sit at, and every table has an expert, we call them the faculty, who can give a brief presentation on that topic. So what do you have? You have 10 people around a table who have a common interest in a common issue in the developing world, and it helps develop collaboration among those individuals. And they might be people from NGOs, or they might be donors, and everybody pays or has someone pay for them to come to the dinner. So we make money, but we also further our mission. Now that's the kind of event I happen to like. So keep your wheels spinning on the idea of events. And I think, oh, good, my little pop-up has popped up again. Grr. What I want now, because we were talking about gifts from individuals, I'm going to talk just a moment about the DVETS Foundation and going through there. They were one of the organizations that I worked with on my previous visit here. And I want to show you what their picture looks like. Now, when you guys do this exercise, you're going to have your own pie charts. But this is what their pie chart, if you will, looked like when we began the exercise. And the main thing I want to show you is the big red zone at the bottom, which is contributors from outside of their service area, right? And they also had contributions from individuals. The green slice, that's 9%, is their 1 in a Million campaign, which is their big campaign to receive gifts primarily from individuals, and it's what Anna is going to talk about in a minute. This is how they project themselves in 3 years. So what's the net result? The biggest slice is contributions from individuals, which is the most steady and most secure source of gifts and grants. 40%. And the contributions from outside of Serbia are, now some of the contributors in 1 in a Million are outside of Serbia, so we had to make some, cuts here. But the general contributions from outside of Serbia has gone down to 11%, which means they are a lot less vulnerable to the kind of whims of outsiders. They are much more in control of their own destiny.